Hello, and welcome to episode 15 of Afrikanists Assemble. This month, we asked our contributors to reflect on the people who made the field what it is, people who have been forming and shaping the study of African languages and literatures even before the research project Recalibrating Africanistic came along. The question we asked them was, let's pretend that an Africanist Hall of Fame has been established and you've been approached by the committee and asked to nominate 3 Africanists to be considered for induction. Whom do you choose and why? Here are the names they came up with.
If I were to nominate a number of people for the Africanist Hall of Fame, who are these people that I would nominate? The first one will be a woman of great substance, a world-renowned linguist, and her name is Professor Antonia Yetunde Schleicher. The next person will be a posthumous one, and will be Professor Pius Adesanmi. The last but not the least will be Professor Carolyn Brown of Rutgers University. You need to know the reasons for my choices. The very first choice, anybody who has come in contact with the study of African languages in the United States of America would know the impact and the work that has been done by Professor Schleicher. Not only has she facilitated the production of various textbooks on African languages, she has also held seminars and residencies, especially for new entrants into the field. She is a woman that should be highly honored for the path-breaking role she has played in placing the teaching of African languages on the map in the United States of America and around. The next is late Professor Pius Adesanmi, who was teaching in the university in Canada before he passed on in a plane crash. He really needs no introduction. His digital footprint is enough for everybody to understand the role he played in bringing up young scholars, helping PhD candidates to understand the path and to place Africa at the center of their scholarship. He held residencies in Ghana and in different parts of West Africa to help those who are upcoming and facilitate their path. Professor Pius Adesanmi will never be forgotten. The last, but definitely not the least, is the power behind various thrones, Professor Carolyn Brown of Rutgers University, a historian of no mean repute. Those she has supported would understand why the African American should be one of those in the Africanist Hall of Fame. She has done so much for the African Studies Association, but I'm not sure a lot of people know the kind of contribution she has made. But by inducting her in this Hall of Fame, I'm very certain that a lot more people will get to understand the different things that Professor Carolyn Brown has done and keeps doing.
In my own field of African language literature, I would definitely love to see more Africanists in a Hall of Fame. So for instance, Muhamadi Kijuma, he was born in 1855 and passed away in 1945. He was a musician, a poet and a dancer, and he supplied many European researchers with manuscripts of Swahili poetry and introduced them also to the manuscript culture and Islamic poetry. So he truly shaped our understanding of Swahili in Arabic script. And most of the manuscripts stored in London, Hamburg or Berlin nowadays are in his handwriting, including glossaries and explanations, but he is hardly ever given the full credit. I would also love to see more women. There are so many who kind of often from the background have contributed to research on African language literature. Like, for instance, Khadija, Ahmed, Sheikh Nabhany's wife, who could not even read and write, but she remembered such an incredible amount of poetry and often in her very humble way corrected her husband or me and other researchers. And so she is in there in many books, but she's hardly ever mentioned even for her important contributions. And there are many women like them. Generally speaking, however, I'm also not that sure that I really like halls of fame, since they are often neighbors to halls of shame and blame. And often it's even difficult to say where people fit. So I could mention lots of Africanists who could perfectly feature in all of them at the same time. And I really want to remind us all that, we probably also need to live with some ambivalences rather than replacing one Hall of Fame by another Hall of Fame. So, for instance, let's take a very notorious example, Karl Meinhof. He is highly problematic for his Hamitic theory and his involvement in colonialism, on the one hand, but on the other hand, he also reconstructed Urbantu and proving against lots of prejudices that Africa had a history and its languages had a history comparable to other languages. And this really caused a sensation at his time. And he's even an important point of references for many African scholars, although many others even see or blame him for, with his Hamitic theory, contributing to the genocide and racial hate in Rwanda. So where do we place him? And what do we do with the halls of shame and the halls of fame?
Wole Soyinka is one of the persons whose portrait should be hung in the Hall of Fame because he has contributed to literature, not only in Nigeria, but to Africa and the entire world. He brought pride to Africa through award of Nobel Prize in Literature in 1986. He was the first sub-Saharan African to be honored in that category. Soyinka has been in the vanguard of defense for humanity, particularly the downtrodden in his community. To Nigerians, he is our symbol of cultural value. Kwei is another person whose portrait should be hung in the Hall of Fame. This is because he has also made contributions to the development of knowledge in Africa. His work, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, stood out in depicting corruption, which is still very relevant even in today's Africa. His works are of enduring value. Nelson Mandela is another person whose portrait should be in the Hall of Fame. He spent a good number of years in prison in the course of political struggle. He is a symbol of commitment and resilience in African history and value system. His struggle enhanced the political development in South Africa and has served as a source of courage to those in similar situations.
The three Africanists I would choose are all scholars who taught me in some way and whose work and thought I think is valuable in the field of African studies and beyond. One is Sylvia Ardyn Boone. She was a scholar of art history and African art, and she especially studied and wrote about the representation of women and the feminine in visual art from Africa, in particular West Africa. She was the first Black woman to receive tenure at Yale University. That was in 1988. And she was a wonderful teacher in a course, Women in African Art, that I had the good fortune to take with her in the early 1990s. Her scholarship was really inspiring. I would recommend her book Radiance from the Waters, which is about feminine beauty in Mende art. And personally, I learned a lot from her about aesthetic ideals and their expression in a culture. In class, she showed us how to identify what works of art prized as beautiful and what questions to ask about that ideal. She was also important in making a place for Africa in the discipline of art history. A second nomination would be Yahya Ali Omar, who was born in Mombasa, Kenya, and died in London in 2008 after many years of working to preserve and nurture Swahili language and literature, and also nurture a community of Swahili scholars. Sheikh Yahya assisted many scholars of Swahili. He was the lead researcher on the Swahili Manuscripts Project at SOAS, University of London, that I worked on from 2001 to 2002. And in that time, he shared with me some of his extraordinary knowledge of the Swahili literary tradition, especially poetry, and of Swahili dialects. The workdays that I spent listening to him read Swahili Tenzi aloud and talking about the poems with him were some of the best of my life. It wasn't only me. Sheikh Yahya taught many people about Swahili language and literature. A final nomination would be Ann Bierstecker, who in the US has done so much to nurture the study of African languages and literatures, especially but not only Swahili. Anne taught at Yale University for many years and retired at Michigan State University. She really created a culture of teaching and learning Swahili in the United States, and at the center of it, she put connecting students of African languages in the US to East African intellectuals, so connecting students of Swahili to writers and thinkers on the Kenyan coast, for example. She also really nurtured a tradition of studying Swahili literature and literature from other African languages as literature.
Idan har aka samu ɗakin suna na mutane da suka yi wa binciken nahiyar Afirka hidima, lallai zan so in sanya mutane 3, mata 2 da namiji 1. Na farko zan so a sanya Nana Asma'u, diyar Mujaddadi Usman Dan Fodio, wacce ta rayu tsakanin shekara 1799 zuwa shekara 1864. Nana Asma'u ta kafa tubalin ilmantar da mata tun a wancan lokacin. Ita ta assasa koyar da mai koyarwa a ƙasar Hausa. Takan koyar da malamai mata waɗanda suke shiga saƙo-saƙo da lungu-lungu su koyar da mata addini da zamantakewa. Tun a wancan lokacin, Nana Asma'u ta fahimci amfanin ilimi da karatu da rubutu. Shi ya sanya ta rubuta littattafai da wasiƙu da ƙasidu na siyasa waɗanda har yanzu akwai sauran ire-iren waɗannan ayyukan. Nana Asma'u ta kasance abar koyi ga mata masu tasowa a yau a dukkanin faɗin arewacin Najeriya. Mace ta biyu ita ce Zainab Alƙali. Ita ce marubuciyar ƙagaggun labarai na harshen Turanci da ta yi fice a arewacin Najeriya. Alƙali ta yi ƙoƙari ƙwarai da gaske wajen assasa wannan fage na rubutu tare da fito da matsalolin da mata ke fuskanta a yau. Rubutun nata ya jawo hankali sosai akan amfanin ilimin mata da kuma inganta rayuwarsu. Nasarar da ta samu ta sanya mata da yawa a yau suna yin rubutu ba tare da tsangwama ba. Ita ta fito da hanyoyin gabatar da matsalolin da suka shafi mata ba tare da ta yaƙi tubalin da al'ummar musulmi mazauna yankin arewa ba. Na ƙarshe zan so a sanya a cikin ɗakin suna ko fifiko shine marubuci Ngugi Thiong'o, ɗan asalin ƙasar Kenya. Ngugi ya nuna yadda marubuci zai jagoranci rajin tabbatar da adalci a cikin al'umma. Ya fara rubutu tun yana ɗalibin jami'a. Daga littafinsa na farko zuwa yau, marubucin ya kasance tsayayye wajen yaƙi da almubazzarancin shugabanni da kuma musgunawa talakawa. Wani abin burgewa da Ngugi shine yadda ya kawo zancen rubutu a cikin harsunan Afirka kafin a fassara zuwa harshen nahiyar Turai. Ya kawo wannan zancen kuma ya aikatar da shi. Wannan ya kawo bunƙasar harsuna da dama da ke nahiyar Afirka. Zan so in ga sunayen waɗannan mutane guda 3 a cikin ɗakin suna ko fifiko na manazartan kimiyyar nahiyar Afirka. Na gode.
I nominate Sigismund Wilhelm Kole and Ali Elisami Gazirma for the Hall of Fame of Africanists. I'm indebted to Carolyn Ripstein, who recently drew my attention to these 2 people. Sigismund Kole is not a surprise for such a Hall of Fame. He is considered the founder of Afrikanistic, with his Polyglotta Africana that he published in 1854. The Polyglotta Africana is a collection of words in more than 100 languages spoken in Sierra Leone at the time, and even the brothers Grimm dedicated a whole chapter to him in their Haus- and Kindermärchen. Sigismund Kole was a missionary linguist and was sent to Fura Bay Institution in Freetown in order to teach classical languages and to study African languages, make them accessible for missionary work. Fura Bay Institution is one of the oldest colleges of higher education in Africa. It was founded by the British Church Missionary Society and actually it exists until today. But Sigismund Wilhelm Kole arrived there in Fura Bay in 1847 and started looking around which languages he could describe. At the time, Sierra Leone, as we know, Freetown, was a place of so-called liberated African people. It means that in the aftermath of slavery and the end of slavery, many African people from Western Africa were more or less stranded there in Freetown. This was also the case of Ali Elisami Gazirma. Ali Elisami Gazirma was from Borno State, which we can locate today in Niger and northern Nigeria, in that area. His father was a famous Malim, himself highly educated person, but due to famine, due to wars, Fula wars, Sokoto jihad, he had to flee his home and was sold to Hausa people and then to Spanish people, where he was then liberated and brought to Freetown. He arrived in Freetown about 1818 at the age of 13 years. We know all of this because he has contributed his own biography, a narrative. However, that stops with his arrival in Sierra Leone. Now, when young Sigismund Wilhelm Kole comes to Fura Bay, he meets with Ali Elisami Gazirma. We know that young Kole and elderly Elisami were working together for about 6 years, from 1848 to 1853, on the Kanuri language. Sigismund Kole published in 1854 the grammar of the Borno or Kanuri language, for which actually he was awarded prizes and was praised and is now the founder of historical linguistic comparative work, together with the Polyglotta Africana, of course, which is much more famous. However, it is really interesting to think about what these two men were doing in those 6 years. Sitting next to each other, talking to each other on that veranda of the Fura Bay Institution, hours and hours and hours. And one wonders, what were they doing? We can't say, because actually I believe they were doing two different things. Sigismund Kole was to write the grammar. He was to collect material, and there is plenty of material accompanying this grammar of the Kanuri language. Ali Elisami Gazirma probably was looking for an intellectual counterpart, talking to somebody who could acknowledge, who could value all his knowledge that he had. Elisami was, as I said, highly educated. He knew Arabic script, was very conversant with Islamic literature, and so on. But since we don't have any account of Elisami, what happened during those 6 years, we don't really know. And Kole himself was not interested so much in these intellectual conversations, but he was interested in writing that grammar. What I find fascinating and what is important to take note of is that without Elisami, there would have been no grammar of the Borno or Kanuri language. So it's not only Sigismund Kole who deserves to be in the Hall of Fame of Africanists, but also Elisami Gazirma. This story also reminds us that the foundations of Africanistic lie in a time of social and political upheaval in Western Africa, where people are displaced. It is also relevant to understand that Sigismund Kole, while he was looking around and trying to get a lot of information, he came across Elisami Gazirma and started working on Kanuri, while it became clear quite soon that Kanuri would never play an important role in missionary work in Sierra Leone. But this raises the question about the foundations of Africanistic. We have to understand that Africanistic is built on a colonial encounter on the one hand, and on the other hand, on social and political turmoil, upheaval, and the displacement of plenty of people, who then were used as data source for writing grammars for understanding African people, to come to terms with what Arrington says, this colonial conundrum of sameness and difference. We should also maybe understand that despite the purity of grammar that is at the heart of classical Africanist work, is based on a diasporic character of linguistic sources. For their very encounter and for the possibility that their encounter affords us for critique of the foundations of Africanistic, I think they both are worthy of having a space in the Hall of Fame of Africanists. Sigismund Wilhelm Kole and Ali Elisami Gazirma.
If I am to nominate 3 Africanistic to be considered for an Africanistic Hall induction, I will start by nominating Ngugi wa Thiong'o as my number 1 for pushing his argument on language. Ngugi did not see language as a tool for communication only, but as that which is embedded with one's culture and values. Speaking one's language and writing it will serve as some bank for one to understand his or her worldview. We have lost some of our folk science, folk politics, folk way of life because most of us have neglected our languages. Secondly, I would like to nominate Wole Soyinka for exploring African mythology through the Yoruba tragedy or Yoruba myth, which now places African mysteries and potential on the world stage. Thirdly, I would also want to nominate Achebe for his effort in translating African languages to English to make them more accessible to people, especially in his use of proverbs. I commend him and I would love to nominate him.
Here are 3 names which I would like to see in a potential Africanist Hall of Fame. The first one is that of Elena Bertoncini-Zubkova, who in 1968 established the chair of Swahili language and literature at the University of Naples L'Orientale, where she taught until 2009. Bertoncini has pioneered in building a body of knowledge on Swahili literature and its history, a body of knowledge constructed in continuous contact with Swahili writers and linguists, and which has been used as a frame of reference in the whole of the European contexts of Swahili studies ever since. She was also a dedicated translator of Swahili literature into Slovak, her mother tongue, and Italian. The second name is that of Alamin Mazrui, who comes from a generation of eminent scholar, the Mazrui family of Mombasa, and he is also the nephew of Ali Mazrui. Alamin Mazrui is professor of sociolinguistics and cultural studies at Rutgers School of Arts and Sciences. His research and countless publications have had the merit to put the East African literary, linguistic, and more broadly intellectual field in dialogue with many other disciplines, such as international politics and economics, religious studies, and many contexts from Middle East to South Asia and the US, therefore bringing discussion on East African cultural spaces at a global level. And the third name is that of Sol Plaatje, a political activist, journalist, historian, translator, novelist, and linguist, lived between 1876 and 1932. As a Setswana speaker, he also learned English, Afrikaans, German, French, Soto, Zulu, and Xhosa. He was not only a writer, Moody is his most famous novel about love and war, but also compiled a Tswana English dictionary, a phonetic reader, published collections of proverbs and Bantu folk tales and poems, and also translated a number of Shakespeare's plays into Setswana, the first published translations of Shakespeare's plays into an African language.
If I have an opportunity to nominate 3 Africanists for induction in Africanist Hall of Fame, I would nominate William E. Wermas, Chinua Achebe, and Anastosh. I would gladly nominate late Professor William E. Wermas, a missionary linguist, for his important contributions on African languages, which include Igbo, Yoruba, Jukun, Efik, among others. His works, for example, the Dictionary of Igbo, provided a good foundation for letter scholarship in the language. Also, his book, African Language Structures, published in 1973, remains a veritable resource material in African studies. Although recent works in some of the languages Wiemas worked on have identified some gaps in his works, but for me, the contributions of missionary linguists such as Wiemas, who worked under austere conditions to produce foundational texts, remain significant in the growth of African studies. The second person I would gladly nominate is late Professor Chinua Achebe, a celebrated African literary artist who gained popularity through his publications of literary works, which include Things Fall Apart, Arrow of God, A Man of the People, among others. I consider Achebe the artist worthy of the prestigious honor. His novel, Things Fall Apart, which has been translated to about 50 languages, do not just provide a realistic portrayal of African culture and history. His work serves as timeless resource materials for the study of Igbo language, as well as its interrelationship with the society. The third person I would make bold to nominate is the German linguist Professor Anna Stosch, who has done extensive works on the description of African languages, their usages in diverse contexts, and on registers in African languages. My interest in her works on African languages in Nigeria, especially, is on the unique and intriguing perspectives on what people do with language and on how language responds to the manipulations in varied communicative contexts. In particular, I consider her book Secret Manipulations, Language and Context in Africa as one of the refreshing and significant works in contemporary scholarship in African languages, especially on the social-linguistic aspect of African languages.
An Africanist, in simple terms, is one whose interest is in African cultures or African languages. Within the African literary parlance, some writers, through their literary works, have projected the African way of life to the outside world. One of such writers I consider fit for induction if an Africanist Hall of Fame was established is Chinua Achebe. This is because the Nigerian-born writer Chinua Achebe is arguably considered to be the premier novelist on the discourse of African identity, cultural assertion, decolonization, and its attendant sense of discontent. All of this could be traced to his works, some of which are Things Fall Apart, Arrow of God, No Longer at Ease, A Man of the People, Antis of the Savannah, amongst others. In projecting the African culture, Achebe is notable for incorporating African oral forms such as folktales, local proverbs, myths, legends, songs, stories, amongst others, into his literary works. Generally, Achebe's novels could be seen as important features of the African literary landscape that have come to be read and taught as important sources of knowledge about Africa. The second person I would like to nominate is Ngugi wa Thiong'o. This is because Ngugi, the Kenyan novelist, dramatist, and essayist, advocates African language literature as the only viable and authentic voice for Africans in telling their own story, as contained in his book Decolonizing the Mind, The Politics of Language in African Literature, published in 1986. He argues in that book that African writers should write in their native languages, not the colonial languages of English or French. To him, the best way to decolonize the African mind is to reclaim African languages. To show his commitment to this vision, he wrote a novel, Devil on the Cross, in his native Gikuyu language in the 70s, when he was imprisoned by the Kenyan government for writing a play that slammed the ruling class, a play that was performed by local actors in their native language instead of English. Generally, his works focus on Kenya, by extension Africa, paying attention to traditionalism, cultural nationalism, legacy of colonialism, tension between modernity and the past, and the role of the intellectual in the post-colonial African society. So, Junior Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, for me, I consider them as Africanists that could be nominated for induction into the Africanist Hall of Fame because of their contribution in promoting African culture, African way of life through their literary works.
Those were the people our contributors thought should be inducted into the Africanist Hall of Fame. As you can see, several names came up again and again. Do you think they missed anyone who should be nominated? Tell us who and why they should be considered in the comments below. Thanks so much for tuning in to Africanists Assemble. Make sure you hit that subscribe button below so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. See you next month.
Chido soda bechi